We will now move on to the Republic of Korea, otherwise known as South Korea. And we'll talk a little bit about the development of democracy first. So I had us watch that documentary about democratization in the Republic of Korea, and that was made in the early 90s. And we have to remember the 1980 was the Gwangju Massacre, where Chun Doo-hwan, a general, will seize power. In 1987, he had gone back on his promise for free elections, but massive Korean protests force him to go back on going back and actually allow the free elections. And I think that's a really good documentary to watch. It's excellent. I actually watched it when I was in college. And one issue, of course, is that it's kind of frozen in time. That documentary was made almost 30 years ago, right? So it only could bring us up to 1990, and it kind of left us with this question, will Korea become a democracy? All the way, fully. And the answer, of course, is yes. And my job, in a sense, here is to kind of get us to the point where it does become a democracy and say a few things about it today. So you may remember that Chun Doo-hwan had wanted to appoint his, basically his protege, Roh-tae-woo, to be president. He was forced to allow an actual full election, though a full democratic election, by these protests. But what happened was the two Kims, Kim Dae-jung, who we talked about, and Kim Yong-sam, who we did not talk about, they are going to both want to be president, and so the opposition will split. And it basically splits along regional lines. Kim Dae-jung is from Cholla province, is in the southwest. He's from South Cholla province. There's a North Cholla and a South Cholla. He's from South Cholla, but that's in the west, southwest of South Korea. Kim Yong-sam was from the southeast, and so there was this kind of regional split. So what ended up happening was Roh-tae-woo is able to win the election. And so his party, the party of Chun Doo-hwan and the party of Roh-tae-woo, will stay in power. Now, this is important. The reason I'm making a big deal about a party here is that full democracy, one definition, how do we know if a country's a democracy or not? Did the party in power lose an election and peacefully hand power over to the party that was elected? Right. So to give you an example, we can say the United States is a full democracy in this sense. Why? Because there was, for example, the most recent election at the time of this recording was that of the Republican candidate Donald Trump versus the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton. At the time, President Obama was president. He was a Democrat. The Democrats lost the election and peacefully allowed transfer of power to the Republicans, right? They didn't fight. They didn't try and change the Constitution. They didn't stage a coup. There was no armed violence. That rates you as a full democracy. So that's why I'm making a big deal about the political party. So even though the president changed, Chun Doo-hwan is no longer president, Roh-tae-woo is going to become president, the same political party is in charge. And then what happens when there's another election, and Koreans, in the Korean Constitution, South Korea, you can only be president once for 6 years, right? In the United States, we allow 2 4-year terms. They allow 1 6-year term. So when his term was up, what happened was basically they formed an alliance with the old opposition leader, Kim Yong-sam, and then that party got to stay in power, right? So even though there's these free democratic elections starting in 1988, the party that the same party is going to stay in power. And this is the party of Chun Doo-hwan, the guy who had led the military dictatorship. So we're still not quite ready to say that Korea is a full democracy. Now, during this time period, they're going to continue this emphasis on economic development. Korea will continuously develop its economy, not as rapidly as it had previously, but it will still develop. There are some structural problems with the economy that I'm not going to get into, but in 1996-97, there's going to be a massive economic crisis in South Korea. And again, I don't want to get too much into detail here about this, but it's a really bad crisis, and I'm just going to give you an example. It made the value of Korean money worth half of what it had been previously, right? So the Korean currency dropped in half. And I started college in 1996, and I had all these Korean friends, and they were really in trouble because all of a sudden their tuition bills doubled, right? They are paying their tuition money with US dollars that they purchase using Korean won. And the Korean won suddenly lose half its value against the dollar, so their tuition bills just doubled. And this was just a terrible crisis for them. So there's this economic crisis in 1996-97. So the political right has been in charge for 10 years, this party of Chun Doo-hwan and then so forth, No Tae-woo, and then Kim Yong-sam. And then they had this economic crisis. So it's pretty much time for another political party to have their chance to try and run Korea, right? And in this case, the conservatives, the political right, they're the ones that have been in charge for 10 years. 96, 97, there's a terrible economic crisis. So the stage is set in 1998 for Kim Dae-jung, right? This guy we've been talking about, this Democratic activist from Cholla province, who they mentioned in that documentary a lot and who they interviewed. He will win. He represents the political left in South Korea in this time period. And so we can finally say that we have the achievement of full democracy, because in 1998, right, the political right, the party on the right, will lose an election and will peacefully hand over power to Kim Dae-jung, who represents the party on the left. The party that was out of power has now peacefully taken power through an open democratic election. So we can say South Korea is a full-fledged democracy, and that's true to this day. So, I just want to emphasize that, because that documentary left us with this feeling kind of like, oh my gosh, South Korea is kind of in chaos. And even when the first time I went to Korea was in 2000, there were still lots of riot police around. Like, they were like everywhere. And sometimes they'd be running around where we were trying to go. It was kind of confusing at times. But you're not going to really see them much anymore. So we now have the achievement of full democracy. And to give you a sense of the strength of this democracy, former President Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo will be arrested and actually put in prison for the various crimes they committed when seizing power, and for the torture and killings and things like that. They will both be pardoned, but they will serve some time in prison. Now, one thing that they talked about in that documentary was South Korea's very strong anti-communism. There tended to be pretty strict, often very strained relationships between North and South Korea. And Kim Dae-jung wanted to try and fix that. He wanted to try and resolve that. He said, okay, we've got this new, we've got a new government in South Korea. Let's try and follow a new policy towards North Korea. And he launched what is called the Sunshine Policy. And you may have heard this story, but there's a bet between the sun and the wind over who can get a guy to take off his jacket, right? The sun and the wind getting a bet. Who's going to get this guy to take off his jacket? And the wind blows as hard as it can to try and get the guy to take off his jacket, and it doesn't work. And this, and the idea is force doesn't work. But the sun just becomes hot, and the guy just will take off his jacket, so he'll be cool. And so the idea, basically, the Sunshine Policy was, let's be nice to North Korea. Let's not try and take over North Korea. Let's not be provocative towards North Korea. Let's be nice. They don't have a lot of money. Let's give them some money. Let's give them some assistance. Let's engage with them. Right, and this is kind of the theory, is that if we work with North Korea, if we form good relationships with North Korea, they will see that we don't want to hurt them, that we only want to help them, and that working together would really be better for all of us. And that's the basic idea, is that we can change North Korea through peaceful engagement. That was the Sunshine Policy. And following that policy, it won Kim Dae-jung the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Won him the Nobel Peace Prize. And also it led to this image here, and that's Kim Dae-jung on the left, toasting with Kim Jong-il, drinking to unification, I believe, in North Korea. The president of South Korea actually traveled to North Korea, and they had this champagne toasting, and this was considered the high point, right? Where it looked like, wow, something maybe is really going to happen. We have these belligerents actually sitting down, having a conversation. Maybe something's good is going to happen here. The problem is that it turns out that this involved giving the North Koreans hundreds of millions of dollars. I think something like $500 million, basically, to make this happen. And this has been basically presented as kind of a bribe, according to critics, right? The Kim Dae-jung administration understood it differently, of course. But basically, this cost a lot of money. And, of course, talking now, we know it didn't work. This did not lead to unification. It did not lead to any kind of long-term change, in a sense, in terms of the relationship. We'll talk more about that later in the lecture. So the thing is, I didn't want us to end with this kind of image of democracy being weak in South Korea, right? Democracy is very strong in South Korea, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But I do want to note one other thing, because we're talking about Kim Dae-jung. In that documentary, we saw a lot of anti-American sentiment, and that has gone down, I think, quite a bit. When I first went to South Korea, it was a bit stronger. But then at the same time, especially people who were older were very pro-American, especially people who were old enough to remember the Korean War. They tend to be more pro-American because they remember, oh yeah, the Americans, they're the guys that prevented us from being taken over and killed by some of these North Korean and Chinese soldiers, and they're the people who gave us food so we could survive. So those people tend to be very pro-American. Not a lot of them left now because of the passage of time. But the anti-American sentiment has gone down, and there are, of course, reasons, as they explain in that documentary, why Koreans might take an anti-American perspective on things. And I certainly don't want to say everything that the United States did in Korea was correct. For example, I do not think Ronald Reagan should have been so welcoming to Chun Doo-hwan after he basically just, launched a military coup. I think that was highly problematic. But one thing I want to note, the United States also intervened positively for democracy. And to give you one example, under Park Chung-hee, Park Chung-hee hated Kim Dae-jung because he was the opposition leader. This was in the documentary. And Kim Dae-jung actually was forced to flee to Japan. Park Chung-hee sent agents to Japan. They drugged and kidnapped Kim Dae-jung and put him on a boat. And their idea was to take him out in the middle of the ocean and murder him and throw his body into the deep ocean, and he would never, of course, be found. The Americans learned about this and actually sent like a helicopter to follow the boat. And so that the South Korean agents who were supposed to murder Kim Dae-jung knew that the United States knew what they were trying to do and weren't going to allow that. So the United States basically saved Kim Dae-jung's life and allowed him to survive and continue to act in opposition. So I don't want us to just see the United States as just always acting negatively. This isn't a class about the United States, of course, so I don't want to go into too much detail there, but I just want to note that, because that's one thing I find is that there's a tendency just to focus on negative American actions. And while those things do exist, we only get part of the story if that's all we focus on. So this is a more recent image of the city of Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Quite a wealthy place. It's actually a great place to visit. Even if you don't know Korean, I highly encourage you, if you can, to get to Korea. Have a wonderful time in Seoul. Very easy to get around, very safe city, awesome place. But I want to show this image to show that this economic prosperity did occur, right? You watch this documentary that kind of ends in 1990. South Korea is certainly wealthier than it was. And I remember when I first went to South Korea, there was a sense that, even when I was in Seoul, I felt like the United States was really ahead in terms of technology. But now when I go back to the Republic of Korea, to Seoul, it's always changing. And it's just amazing the technology that they have and just the wealth that has accumulated in just the last couple decades. So I just have to admit or emphasize, right? If you go there today, especially if you're someone who's originally from South Carolina, if you're from a rural area or something like that, it's just astounding when you go there, right? Just like I said, the amount of technology and the ease of movement and things like that is just really, and the wealth is just really impressive and astounding. So South Korea has, like Japan, achieved a huge amount of economic development, right? They have achieved a huge amount of economic development. And also they have achieved a large amount of democracy. And we looked at, again, this documentary that was focusing on the 1980s, and there was quite a bit of violence there, right? I mean, I was really struck, and I hope you saw this early in the documentary. I mean, you had South Korean students throwing Molotov cocktails at the police, and that one poor police officer early in that video, he got hit by the Molotov cocktail, and he was on fire. I mean, this is just shocking, this level of violence. And I want us to kind of remember that to explain how Korean politics has kind of changed. And I want to start with this picture to kind of tell us, this is one thing I think is fascinating about South Korea, but also to highlight how strong of a democracy we have, even, and how much it's changed since just the 1980s. but this is a picture of Park Chung-hee and his wife and their children. And you can see the tallest child, the one in the back, Park Geun-hye, that is his oldest daughter, right? That's his oldest daughter right there in the back. And there she is as a young lady, again with her father, Park Chung-hee. And there they are. A lovely picture, I think. And there she is with President Obama, right? There's Park Geun-hye with former President Obama. And a question you might ask yourself is, why is President Obama meeting with the daughter of a former dictator of South Korea? And the answer is simple, because when this meeting took place, she was the president of South Korea, right? Park Geun-hye was very popular among many South Koreans, especially in the older generation, who hoped that, like her father, she would help work an economic miracle. And I want to stress, she wasn't just trading on her family name. She was an incredibly tough woman and in many ways a very brilliant politician. And one thing to give you a sense of who she was as a politician and just as a kind of a very tough lady, she was known as the queen of elections, because if she would come down and support your bid for election, you would probably win. So she was out giving a speech to support a candidate, and someone in the audience who didn't like her jumped on her and stabbed her in the face with a knife. And she had to be rushed to surgery. She spent several hours in surgery. And when she regained consciousness, her first words were, "Did we win the election?" Right? So very tough lady, right? Very tough lady. Now, one very curious thing about the Republic of Korea is that you don't want to really be president. Presidents of Korea don't usually end up well, right? You know, if you think about this, the first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, was driven from office, forced to resign. Park Chung-hee, of course, will be assassinated in office. Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo will be thrown in prison. Kim Yong-sam, and he doesn't really have anything too bad happen to him other than it becoming very unpopular. Kim Dae-jung now is kind of tarnished with this issue about the possibly spending huge amounts of money to get North Korea to have this meeting. When I was in South Korea in 2008, 2009, a former president of Korea actually committed suicide, No Moo-hyun, because of allegations of corruption against his children. And it's just really dangerous to be president of Korea. And Park Geun-hye ran into this danger herself. She ended up basically being charged with corruption and was sharing state secrets. She had this old friend of hers that she used as kind of a political advisor, and she shared state secrets with her. And also, basically, I won't go into it, but there was some corruption involved as well. And so there were massive street demonstrations against her, these kind of candlelight vigils. And you can see them here. And this is in the main square of the city of Seoul. And these things were huge. And what's astounding about them was that they were basically entirely peaceful, right? We saw in the 1980s how when South Koreans did not like the government, you had these protests that were often dominated by students that could be incredibly violent. I mean, kidnapping a police officer, setting a police officer on fire. That's pretty violent. But this was different, right? These were different. These families participated in these protests. And these massive protests eventually forced President Park to resign, right? She had to resign the presidency. And there she is being escorted to her trial. She's dressed very nicely, but if you look very closely at her hands, she has handcuffs on, right? So she is going to be going to be put on trial and found guilty and imprisoned. And this happens all very peacefully, right? There's not massive violence. There's not anything like a coup. So this is a sign of a healthy democracy. So South Korea, its history is just amazing. I mean, you had one of the poorest countries in the world in the 1950s. You had a dictatorship for a long time, authoritarian style of government. And now we have a very wealthy country that enjoys a lot of freedom, right? So in many ways, South Korea is one of the success stories, I think, of the post-World War II era. And remember how I mentioned earlier this problem, why isn't China cool? And my argument, of course, was that even though China has a lot of economic prosperity, there's just not a lot of freedom to allow the artists to work. And I think as they get more freedom, and by artists, I mean that broadly. I don't mean just like painters, but I mean people who write, people who make dramas, people who are musicians. I think that will spread over time, and China probably will become cool. But right now, as of the recording of this lecture, Korea is very cool, right? You've probably heard of the Korean wave. And, when I studied Korea when I was young, not that many people were interested in Korea. And it was not, and if they were interested in Korea, it was because of the Korean War. But now I have all these students who when I tell them, oh yeah, I study Korea, they're like, oh yes, I love BTS, right? And that's them on the right. And I chose BTS in that image in particular because that's from their song Dope, which is contrary to what the name might indicate, is actually a song about why you should work hard, which I think is very Korean, and I will sometimes play it for my students to encourage them to work hard. But on the left, what I think is fascinating, that is Chae Ji-woo, who is one of the favorite actresses of my wife. She loves Korean drama. She's from the Philippines, but she loves Korean drama. And that is a Japanese magazine, and Chae Ji-woo is very popular in Japan. And I think it's fascinating. She's from Busan, a city very close to Japan, and they have a nice little statue of her looking out towards Japan. It's kind of cool. And so Koreans, even though they're small, because their country is wealthy and because it has a lot of freedom, they're able to have this Korean wave. They're able to export their popular culture and in some ways compete with Japan, which makes Koreans really happy. For Koreans, whenever they can beat Japan at anything, oh wow, are they happy. And I've had Koreans who are like, oh yeah, the Japanese won another Nobel Peace Prize. We're really depressed. So it's still this kind of rivalry. And I just want to briefly mention Changnara. Changnara is a Korean drama actress, and she also will sing. She's my wife's current favorite. My wife used to really be in Chae Ji-woo, and now she's more into Changnara. But what's fun about Changnara, and one reason I want to highlight it, other than the fact that I can tell my wife and she'll be happy that I mentioned it in my video lecture, she's also, and this is you can tell from the picture on the right, is very popular in China. Right, she's very popular in China. So she's an example of a Korean drama person becoming popular in China. She sings in Chinese and speaks in Chinese and is very popular as a Korean actress. And that's her when she was in kind of a comedy martial arts movie. It's kind of funny because she weighs maybe 90 pounds and they put her on wires and had her flying around beating up people, and it's just hilarious. But she's an example of how, again, we had this Korean wave. We have these Korean dramas being popular in China, which drives some members of the Communist Party in China crazy. If they let up on the freedom thing, of course, I think I think the Chinese will be able to compete with Koreans in that realm. And I want to mention Annie Scher, who I mentioned earlier in the video lecture. I said, do you know Changnara? My wife's into her, and she's like, oh yeah, yes, all we Chinese know Changnara. She's very popular. So kind of interesting, I think. And we see this kind of East Asian culture kind of circulating around. And as I have done before, I want to mention some of the Korean people I know. Again, so you can see people personally. That is, on the left is a young lady named Jisoo. On the right is her boyfriend, Minuk. Both of them were students at Lander University. And in fact, that's where they met and fell in love. And they always, whenever I go back to Korea, we always meet. They're going to visit Greenwood, I believe, shortly. And I'm looking forward to seeing them again. But they were always quite a joy to see. On the left, you can see me with a former Lander student, Matthew Whitmire, and then next to him is Isul, who also was a former Lander student. They became friends at Lander, and there we are in Seoul together. So one thing I highly recommend, if you know one of our students, international students, I highly recommend you go visit them. Lots of fun. To see them in their home country. And it's especially fun to have it kind of reverse because right when they're in the United States, sometimes you have to help them with their English and help them understand things. But then you go to Korea and the shoe's on the other foot. And on the right, that's me with one of our friendship family daughters, Sophie, Lee Hyun-jung. She now works at a water conservation NGO in Korea. She also studied at Lander University. There we are in a subway platform having our picture taken. But she was, we always had a lot of fun with her because she actually, like many people in East Asia, she studied English in the Philippines. So she also had learned some Filipino, and my wife loved it because she's Filipino. And so they spoke Filipino together. And it's funny because she calls me Tatay, not my wife, Sophie, which means father in Filipino. So it's kind of funny. So this Korean woman calls me father in Filipino. And there we are having a lovely lunch together. That's kind of a typical, well, I shouldn't say typical, but usually when Koreans eat, they have a lot of side dishes. And then you had the main dish, and this was at a restaurant. So they fed us, it's kind of a famous restaurant. And so they had a lot of very delicious side dishes. And so I wanted to include this just also to recognize the generosity of my student who was so excited that she now had a job and could treat me. I also wanted to note how delicious this Korean food is. So I recommend you go see your Korean friends, eat Korean food, or go to Japan or China, wherever. Just go get there, form these personal relationships. It's a lot of fun. And one thing I did with Lee-hyun Jung, Sophie, her and her father and I went on a tour of the DMZ that separates North and South Korea. And this is a picture I took during that tour of North Korea. And I wanted to do this especially because the other documentary we're going to watch on North Korea, it focuses on kind of like, a lot of negative things about North Korea, the poverty and those kinds of problems. And those are totally there. I don't want to play that down. But two things that I want to emphasize. One is just North Korea is very beautiful, right? It's very lovely. It's very pretty landscape, as you can see, lots of green, lots of mountains. It is a beautiful place. But also it's really weird when you're standing by the DMZ because you can see how this is an artificial line, right? There, it's clearly just one country moving from south to north or moving from north to south, however you want to say it, right? That this is clearly a human-made division. And I want to highlight what's kind of sad is I can't show you a picture of North Korean people because I don't know any. The closest I got, and I don't think I wasn't able to get a good picture of it, but there was a man riding a bicycle. That's the closest I got to a North Korean person other than at a conference where there were some North Korean people who were there, but I wasn't really able to talk to them much. So I just wanted to kind of highlight, the artificial nature of this division. And also, of course, how lovely North Korea is in terms of its geography. And the thing is, it makes sense to have union, right? It makes Korea for more than 1,000 years was a single country with a shared culture, shared civilization, separated, divided in large part because of colonization and the Cold War. And there's this desire for union, right? And this is a picture I took during our trip at a part of the DMZ tour in which you can see this idea of bringing together people, putting together this divided world, right? That's kind of the hope. And what makes it really hard to do that, in a sense, is how different North and South Korea now are, right? South Korea is fabulously wealthy democracy. North Korea is a totalitarian regime where people have a hard time just getting enough food to eat, right? And so we have this very difficult situation, right? How do you build union between two countries that are so fundamentally different?